riprendiamo i nostri lavori e un ringraziamento per vedervi ancora qui, quindi riprendiamo il nostro percorso. Do soltanto una comunicazione per quanto riguarda la pubblicazione degli atti di questo convegno che stiamo facendo, no? L'editore che solitamente lavora con noi e che pubblica tutte le nostre opere è Bulzoni, come penso voi sappiate già, e l'idea sarebbe appunto quello di fare il primo volume della classe africana entro ovviamente l'anno 2015, in modo tale che arrivando al nuovo dies academicus, che dovrebbe essere più o meno come date in questo periodo, avremmo già il primo volume del nostro lavoro fatto. Ecco. L'idea sarebbe anche quella, visto l'importanza degli articoli, cioè delle relazioni che hanno avuto anche un apporto fotografico notevole, di utilizzare sia testo scritto e sia testo fotografico, possibilmente in colore là dove è possibile e in bianco e nero dove è possibile. Vediamo un attimo poi di... In questo senso i nuovi segretari, adesso abbiamo i segretari provvisori, coadiuveranno il lavoro delle sezioni, quindi sostanzialmente come deadline per la consegna degli articoli poniamo il mese di aprile, data precisa non ancora definita, la definiremo poi quando vi invieremo anche notizie più specifiche riguardo ai criteri tecnici, diciamo, metodi di traslitterazione, queste cose qua insomma che Bulzoni utilizza, ve li faremo avere in modo tale che poi potranno essere utilizzati da voi comodamente. Ecco. Quindi lascio la parola subito a Camplani e ricominciamo la nostra sessione. Grazie.
Allora intanto buona mattinata a tutti. Iniziamo i lavori di stamattina con un leggero ritardo, ma è dovuto alla tradizione italiana del quarto d'ora accademico, e quindi inizio subito a presentare il primo dei nostri relatori, Ted Erho, di origine canadese ma attualmente researcher presso la Ludwig Maximilian Universität München, con un progetto che riguarda il Second Temple Judaism, con particolare attenzione naturalmente al libro di Enoch in etiopico. Lui ha anche attività di ricerca e di catalogazione presso the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library per quanto riguarda appunto la catalogazione di manoscritti in genere etiopici, anche in questo caso Gaes. Quindi ho il piacere di introdurre questa relazione che riguarda il pastore di Erma in Etiopia. Grazie.
Thank you. Composed in Rome in the mid-2nd century, the Shepherd of Hermas quickly rose to prominence in Christian circles throughout the imperial world. A Latin translation appeared within a generation or two to serve congregations in Western lands, but despite the relative brevity of this period, its Greek original had already spread broadly throughout the more numerous communities in the East by that time. Within the latter dominions, nowhere, it seems, did Hermas become more popular than in Egypt, remaining among the most widely read Christian texts there for the next few hundred years. The shepherd's Egyptian prominence well into the 4th and 5th centuries provide an ideal set of circumstances for its translation into Ge'ez, classical Ethiopic. At the beginning of the 4th century, Ethiopia possessed only a small Christian community centered on the trading port of Adulis, which would likely have been content to continue using Greek texts, had not two events revolutionized their situation over the next few decades. One of these was the unexpected arrival of Frumentius, whose appointment to an important governmental position also provided a foundation for his reorganization of the Christian community. In the 330s, Frumentius journeyed to Alexandria and was consecrated bishop of Ethiopia by Athanasius. subsuming the Ethiopian church into the Egyptian ecclesiastical network. This would provide the customary source for both Christian literature to be translated into Ge'ez and for Ethiopian metropolitans until the 20th century. Doubtless due in large part to the influence of Frumentius on the young king, the Aksumite kingdom of Ezana officially converted to Christianity around the same time, thereby necessitating the need for the scriptures and related writings in a language that could be understood by a much wider portion of the populace. This was the second event that sets the stage for the translation of Christian literature, including the Shepherd of Hermas, from Ge'ez, or into Ge'ez from Egyptian Greek manuscripts. Scholars broadly agree that the first books to receive such treatment were almost certainly the four Gospels and the Psalms. Excerpts of these appear in various Aksumite inscriptions. These were followed by other texts from the Septuagint and New Testament, quasi-canonical literature in circulation throughout Egypt, and historical and theological materials. The canonical limitations imposed by the Council of Hippo, 393, and the Council of Carthage, 397, seem to have had relatively little effect on this process, as a much broader set of works were translated into Ge'ez, among them such pseudo-biblical texts as Enoch, Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah, 4th Ezra, and the Shepherd of Hermas. The criteria for the selection of such books remains mysterious, but some combination of contemporary Egyptian popularity and prior acceptance by church fathers probably played a role. This is especially likely with the first and last of the aforementioned cases, both of which are attested by multiple Greek manuscripts from Egypt from around this time, and which were spoken of or cited with veneration by various authors well into the 4th century. With Hermas, a more decisive factor may have been the 39th festal letter of Athanasius, wherein the patriarch included that book together with the Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, Esther, Judith, Tobit, and the Didache in a grouping of writings that, although not canonical, were deemed useful for instruction. Excepting the Didache, all of these are tested in Ethiopic, and therefore this category of books seems to have also been considered sufficiently valuable to undergo the translation process, most likely in the 5th century. And we might just add here the absence of Maccabees, the Septuagintal books of Maccabees in Ethiopic may further point in the direction of the importance of the 39th festal letter for the history of Ge'ez literature. The status of Hermas in Ethiopian Christendom has been a matter of debate. Leading Orientalists and Ethiopists such as August Doman, Ignazio Guidi, and Enrico Cerulli avowed the book's canonicity. More recently, the same position has been adopted, not in an explicit fashion, but as a foundational presupposition, in a spirited argument by Pierluigi Piovanelli. Criticism of this stance has been articulated by other scholars, most notably Roger Cowley. Discussions of the authoritative status of writings in Ethiopia quickly encounter problems. Perhaps uniquely among Christian traditions, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church does not have a defined list of canonical scriptures. Lists variously adduced in this regard, especially those numbering 81 items, have largely been taken over from other sources, primarily Copto-Arabic ones, and merely represent hermeneutical mathematic gymnastics by one author or another to arrive by whatever means necessary at the required figure. This does not mean, however, that a de facto Ethiopic canon cannot be established, at least for the approximately 550-year period for which a reasonable amount of manuscript data is available. In-depth analysis of probable texts of this type reveals that biblical or scriptural material is generally copied almost exclusively with other books of the same ilk, i.e., there are biblical and non-biblical codices alike. Only rarely do items from both categories appear together. Somewhat more frequently, certain books appear individually in codices, but even then these instances are still limited to minority. By this yardstick, a fairly defined canon from at least the mid-15th century onwards can be identified. In order to establish some criteria for de facto canonicity, let us begin by analyzing the relatively uncontroversial book of Isaiah. In 114 manifestations, it appears by itself 16 times, with disputed texts, i.e., those which appear in some of the aforementioned lists but no other canon, twice, and coupled exclusively with non-canonical material once. On 4 occasions, Isaiah is found in a manuscript with other scriptural writings, as well as a significant minority of material of alternative types. Thus, this text appears in combinatorial and disputable biblical codices 80% of the time, and individually a further 14%. Representation alongside non-canonical material is quite infrequent, but transpires somewhat more often when other biblical material is also present, 3.5%, than without it, less than 1%. Having established some basic parameters, it is now possible to analyze some more debatable cases. Of 105 recorded copies of Ethiopic Enoch, 15 are found alone, 14%, and another 7 in manuscripts containing only writings whose acceptance might be subject to dispute. In 2 instances, namely EML numbers 1950 and 6283, it is found together with very non-canonical material, while in a further trio, it is accompanied by a significant portion thereof and at least one further biblical text. These figures do not deviate greatly from those evidenced above with Isaiah, and thus it may be concluded that 1 Enoch possesses a de facto canonical status for this period. Of 45 complete, or virtually so, exemplars of Jubilees, the book appears by itself 6 times, 13%, alongside disputed texts a further 5, 11%, and once in a predominantly non-biblical manuscript, 2%. Again, such numbers comport broadly with the baselines established with Isaiah, and therefore the de facto canonicity of Jubilees may also be asserted. Turning now to some more dubious texts which also feature in the 81 book lists, the trends shift dramatically. For example, in 19 appearances, the Didascalia never appears alongside any indisputable canonical book. Instead, it is found by itself more than half the time, with disputed texts alone 3 times, and with such writings and non-biblical material a further 4 times. In the final 2 cases, only non-canonical material appears alongside the book. The situation is hardly different with Kelamentos, or Ethiopic Clement. Of 14 occurrences, it registers 8 individual appearances, 57%, 1 each with exclusively and a substantial minority of non-biblical material, 7% apiece, and 4 together with disputed texts, 29%, the only one of whose canonicity is probable being 1 Enoch, that is in EML 6281. Neither of these, therefore, can be considered part of the de facto Ethiopian canon. At present, scholars have access to 3 Ge'ez witnesses to the Shepherd of Hermas, albeit in varying forms. The first of these is a transcription of a manuscript dated 1531, copied at the monastery of Gundagundi in 1847. It was on the basis of this solitary witness that Antoine d'Abadie published the Editio Princeps of the Ge'ez text in 1860, which remains to this day the only printed edition of the Ethiopic version. The transcription can be found in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Abadie 174, while the original manuscript is no longer at its former home and is consequently presumed lost. During the early years of the Second World War, and according to documents that I've just received, it's probably in the year 1940, Antonio Mordini acquired a second copy of Hermas from the same monastery, which he subsequently brought to Italy. This manuscript is now located in the Biblioteca Palentina in Parma, manuscript Parm 3842. A third Ethiopic witness to the text, from the monastery of Tanakirkos, was discovered 1 year ago. However, it is only known in the surrogate form of a microfilm copy at the National Library and Archives Agency of Ethiopia, microfilm EML 8508. Each of the 2 extant Ethiopic manuscripts of the Shepherd of Hermas is of unipartite character, a feature that would seemingly cast the text into the final category alongside Clement and the Didascalia. However, Such a conclusion cannot be reached so preemptorily, since the data pool is so restricted that it might be misleading. Given the duration of the text, it is entirely conceivable that it might have been copied individually, as such offered a suitable length for a manuscript in and of itself. By way of example, the 3 earliest known exemplars of Jubilees, a text whose long-standing scriptural status seems assured, all similarly lack textual companions. Furthermore, one of the copies of Hermas is the product of the Gundegundi Scriptorium, a school from which an unusually high number of contemporaneous unipartite biblical manuscripts are known. Another contributing factor lies in the dearth of data on pre-15th century biblical manuscripts apart from the Gospels and their customary textual arrangements. This is compounded by the fact that there is some evidence to suggest that the de facto scriptural canon may have been adjusted by Emperor Zara Jacob, reigned 1434 to 68, in which case it might be possible that the status of the Shepherd of Hermas was downgraded at that time. In order to resolve the issue of the book's canonicity, it is therefore necessary to turn elsewhere. Evidence for further copies of Hermas in Ethiopia exist in several inventory lists. Usually these are not randomly ordered, and it is possible to infer relationships between certain sets of texts grouped together, especially writings considered scriptural. The earliest, and unfortunately also least clear of these, appears in a 14th century gospel book from Yermascal, located in the northernmost part of Tigray, along the modern-day Eritrean border. On paleographical grounds, this list may be dated to circa 1400. It reads as follows: Gospels 4, Octateuch, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Enoch, Ezekiel, Ezra, Proverbs, Shepherd of Hermas, Homilies 5, John Chrysostom 2, Lives of the Apostles, Lives of the Martyrs 2, Concordances 2, Horologia 4, Barbara, History of the Fathers, Imbacom, Didascalia, Pauline Epistles 3, Catholic Epistles 2, Synodicon, Testamentum Domini 2, Canons, Book of Intercession, Missals 3, Communion Prayer 2, Clement, Lectionary, Apocalypse of Pseudo-Gregory, Vision of Theophilus of Alexandria concerning the flight of the Holy Family to Egypt, Book of the Dormition of Mary, Miracles of George, Book of Christening, Vision, or so it seems, of Paul, Revelation of John 2, Life of Andrianos, Penitence of David, Benyami, Penitence of Adam, Acts of Andrew, Hymns 2, Songs 2, Blessings 2, Praise of Mary 2, Assumption of Mary 2, Ariam 2, Festival Chants 2, Semiani 2, Orologium of Adam and Jesus, Sabhatanag, Melodies, Litanies, Psalter, Life of the Thief, Cabarietti, Vision of Bartholomew. Many of these titles are effectively unknown, but the sections pertaining to biblical literature are fairly clear. All Old Testament books are linked together, progressing from the Octateuch to the historical books, to the prophets, to the wisdom literature, here represented by Proverbs. The New Testament writings, however, are not quite so clearly, neatly defined. As the foundational work of Christian theology, the Gospels are found alone at the head of the list. While somewhat unusual, such a positioning is not unparalleled. The remainder of the New Testament is represented only by the epistemological literature, which is separated from the other biblical material by a number of titles. Somewhat interestingly, the Didascalia, Synodicon, and Testamentum Domini, all of which belong to the so-called broader Ethiopic canon, surround these items. Hermas appears immediately after the Old Testament books, and is followed by an undefined set of familiaries and, most probably, those of John Chrysostom comprising his commentary on Hebrews. In light of its Christological material, it is evident that a link to the preceding group is tenuous. As much of the Shepherd of Hermas is instructional in nature, a connection to the following homiletical material is more acceptable, but such an association can hardly be considered certain. Later listings are more unequivocal. An inventory from the Church of Beta Golgotha in Lalibela, dated early in the reign of Emperor Iskender, reigned 1478 to 94, clearly divides and groups the Old and New Testaments. Octateuch 1, Jubilees 1, Kings 2, Job 2, Psalter 2, Isaiah 1, Jeremiah 2, Ezra 2, Ezekiel 1, Minor Prophets, cannot be seen, Sirach 1, Gospels 5, Pauline Epistles 2, Catholic Epistles 2, Synodicon 3, Didascalia 1, Testamentum Domini 1, Lives of the Apostles 3, Lives of the Martyrs 1, Lectionary for Passion Week 2, John Chrysostom 1, Homily on the Sabbath 1, Lectionaries 3, Enchiridion 1, Shepherd of Hermas 1, Clement 1, Commentary on the Gospels 1, and so on. With the exception of a single copy of the Gospel of John, all of the de facto canonical Old Testament books are followed by their New Testament counterparts without interruption. In sharp contrast, Hermas appears a considerable way down the list, sandwiched between the Enchiridion of Epiphanius and Clement. Again, the Didascalia, Synodicon, and Testamentum Domini follow immediately after the epistles, suggesting that the Shepherd is not even reckoned among the semi-canonical works of that type. This scenario is replicated nearly perfectly in an inventory from the Eritrean monastery of Dabra Meriam, published by Alessandro Bauzi. Octateuch 2, Jubilees 2, Kings 1, Chronicles 1, Isaiah 2, Jeremiah 2, Ezekiel 3, Ezra 1, Daniel 1, Books of Solomon 1, Job 2, Sirach 2, Minor Prophets 1, Maccabees 1, Tobit 2, Judith and Esther 1, Numbers 1, Leviticus 1, Enoch 1, Gospels 8, Catholic Epistles 3, Pauline Epistles 3, Apocalypse of John 3, Synodicon 3, Clement 2, Commentary on the Gospels 1, Testamentum Domini 2, Commentary on John 1, Lives of the Apostles 2, Lives of the Martyrs 4, Concordances, Tomara Tespet 1, Book of Flight 1, Didascalia 2, Shepherd of Hermas 1, and so on. Again, herein the Old and New Testament books follow one another at the head of the list, while the Shepherd of Hermas is found far below, in this case coming after the Didascalia, which has effectively switched places with Clement. Recently, Marie-Laure Dorat and Derese Ayanchu have published a notice of donation of books by Emperor Bada Meriam, reigned 1468 to 78, to the Church of Mashallah Mariam, among whose number is also allegedly Hermas. However, close examination of the supplied evidence reveals that this is the product of scholarly error. Not only does the item in question appear within a series of books of the Old Testament prophets, which would be nonsensical in itself, but the name is transcribed as Hermas, whereas the title is always elsewhere given as Herma. Inspection of the accompanying plate reveals the misreading as Eremias, that is, Jeremiah, is clearly decipherable. Another source that could support a scriptural status for the Shepherd of Hermas would be quotations of it in the writings of Ethiopian authors. As one would expect, such does not occur in the major native works of the 15th century, such as the Book of the Nativity, the Book of Flight, and the Book of Mystery. Homilies attributed to prolific Ethiopian authors of earlier eras, among them Minas of Axum, Johannes of Axum, and the shadowy Ritua Hymenaute, would theoretically be a more likely source if the Shepherd of Hermas possessed the loftier standing during their lifetimes. But unfortunately, almost no literature of this type has been studied or edited or studied. To date, therefore, no quotations of the work have been identified in Ethiopic. On the basis of the preceding, it is thus possible to conclude tentatively that the Shepherd of Hermas did not have the same status as biblical or canonical books from the late 14th century onwards. However, this matter cannot be considered entirely closed, as new information in the form of further manuscripts of the text or references thereto may shift the discussion in new directions. Moreover, due to the lack of any data for earlier periods at present, it is impossible to say whether the situation was different in the Zagwe or Aksumite kingdoms. Taken together, the Ethiopic manuscripts of the Shepherd of Hermas and the inventories referencing additional copies of it indicate the widespread dissemination of the book into almost all of the Christian regions of Ethiopia by the 14th century. At Dabra Meriam in Eritrea, at Gundagundi and Juramaskel in east and central Tigray respectively, at Lalibela in North Wallo, and at Tanakirkos in North Gondar. The absence of the book further south in Gojem and Shoa, lands that were primarily Christianized from the end of the 14th century onwards, would seem to indicate that Hermas was not deemed essential Christian literature by that time and probably had fallen out of widespread use. Consequently, it is doubtful that Shepherd of Hermas reached many locations or was copied much after this time. It is difficult to single out any one factor that led to the book's decline in Ethiopia. Some combination of the following probably played a role. The most dominant factor was likely the translation into Ge'ez of many Christian texts from Arabic in the 13th and 14th centuries. In short order, this new material supplanted much of the Aksumite literary heritage, remnants of which are only slowly beginning to come to light. Another blow was leveled soon thereafter by the rise of many new native theological compositions, especially by Georgis of Sagala and Emperor Zara Yaqub, as this textual influx led to an even greater choice of texts for copying and for use, and by extension for neglect of the older literature, which was becoming increasingly obsolescent. The reign of the aforementioned emperor made an even greater impact, insofar as he was instrumental in pushing both the Ethiopian Empire and its seat of power south. This led to the increasing prominence of certain monasteries, most notably Debre Libanos, and perhaps also Haike Stephanos, where the Shepherd of Hermas may have been entirely unknown. From the literary perspective, royal donations and commissions of ecclesiastical books, which allowed for texts in favor with the ruling authorities to grow quickly in significance and popularity, exacerbated these changes. Writings out of vogue, most Aksumite non-biblical texts, were therefore confined to select monasteries already possessing copies of them. Several mitigating factors seem to have contributed to the survival of at least two manuscripts of the Shepherd of Hermas at the monastery of Gundagundi well into the 19th century. The unusual history of the monastery and its library is key. Although the precise origins of the site are unclear, by the mid-15th century, Gundagundi was firmly established as the primary center of the dissident Stephanite movement. This group was staunchly opposed by several emperors, foremost among them Zara Yaqub. As a result, almost no native Ethiopian literature of that period, apart from the Saxon hagiographical, historical, and theological works, entered into the library there. Moreover, such imperial opposition naturally resulted in the absence of royal donations to the monastery, eliminating a major potential external influence on the shape of the bibliothetical collection. Indeed, of the slightly more than 200 codices in the library today, not one has thus far been identified as a royal donation. Another consequence of the dissident character of the Stephanites is that they had their own scriptorium, which allowed them to exercise control over which texts were copied. The results of these labors, even half a millennium later, are prolific, with at Gundagundi alone, both biblical and non-biblical writings existing in multiple copies of from this era. For example, 4 copies of Jubilees, 3 copies of the Book of Mystery, and 3 copies of the Book of the Disciple and Teacher, which is only known from 3 other copies at all, and in fact in Mordini's hand list is given as 6 copies at Gundagundi. As only so much need existed for even the most popular texts, at certain points scribe turned to literature from the more ancient part of the library, which was extensive. Such occasions probably resulted in new exemplars of such texts as the Shepherd of Hermas and the Treatise of Hippodulus on the Antichrist. Thus, If the preceding reconstruction is correct, well, it would have been virtually impossible for such texts to have been copied at such a late date elsewhere. Special conditions prevailing at Gundagundi allowed for this to take place as late as the 16th century. Their survival to the present can be attributed in part to one further factor, namely the isolation of the monastery, which discouraged both violent and non-violent interference. No copy of the Shepherd of Hermas still exists at Gundagundi. The first exemplar, of which Antoine d'Abadie had a copy made, had disappeared by the early 20th century. Most likely it was simply lost, though it cannot be precluded that it was either transferred to another library within the monastery's ecclesiastical network, or that it was sent elsewhere at the behest of Emperor Johannes IV, who did quite a lot of such things. The second copy was acquired directly from Gundagundi by Antonio Mordini, and now forms part of the collections of the Biblioteca Palentina. Comparatively little is known about Tanakirkos, the other monastery confirmed to have a manuscript of Hermas into the 20th century. Though more accessible than Gundagundi, its cosseted location on a peninsula on the eastern shore of Lake Tana seems to have insulated it against any major attack and resultant loss of books. Indeed, although its library is relatively unexplored, the presence of several manuscripts of 14th century origin suggests that its historical character has been better preserved than most. One more paragraph? Yeah, one more. In addition to these, a further Ethiopic manuscript containing an excerpt of Hermas seems to have escaped attention thus far. In his 1906 Russian catalogue of Ethiopian manuscripts in St. Petersburg, Boris Tureyev recorded a small collection of 6 manuscripts in the possession of local academic Nikolai Likyakov, the first of which, dated to the 17th century, includes 2 leaves with a passage attributed to the shepherd. The incipit may be translated as follows: "Listen, therefore, to what Hermas says. On this day, when I was fasting, the messenger, the one who continually consoles me, came to me." End quote. Well, unfortunately, these lines do not provide an exact parallel with any passage in the Ethiopic text published by d'Abadie. The subject of fasting is found in the 5th similitude, and therefore it is likely that the material derives from that part of the book. As the wide-ranging Likoyakov collections met various fates, it is not known for certain where this manuscript is presently located, though the Institute of Oriental Manuscripts of the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg seems most logical. Although the Ethiopic versions of ancient texts are often granted relatively little value by scholars of early Christianity and late antiquity, such an approach must be reconsidered in light of recent developments. Chief among these is an increasingly clear link for most of the New Testament books between the Ethiopic version and the Greek Alexandrian text type. The latter almost indisputably serves as the Vorlage for the former in some form, with the great codices Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and Vaticanus often standing as some of the closest Greek representatives. In light of the substantial ties between early Ethiopian and Egyptian Christianity, this is hardly surprising. Nevertheless, as only in exceptional cases does the earliest extant Gez manuscript evidence lie within a millennium of the translation for any particular book, and significant corruption of the text between its original Ethiopian form and the earliest attested invariably exists, the transmissional situation remains rather complex. Hence, though somewhat veiled by the vicissitudes of time, the Gez testimony to text translated in the Aksumite period must be considered a highly valuable witness to the early Egyptian and Greek forms. Thank you.
Caro dottor Erho, grazie per questa conferenza molto ricca di documentazione, e chiamo subito Alessandro Gori, così poi dopo dedichiamo qualche minuto alla conclusione. You have to change it because Alessandro will be here, you can see here. Alessandro Gori, dopo una carriera di ricerca all'interno soprattutto dell'università italiana, è attualmente professore all'Università di Copenaghen, si è occupato di letteratura islamica con particolare interesse al Corno d'Africa. Molte sono state le sue pubblicazioni in questo campo, che sono per esempio studi sulla letteratura geografica islamica somala in lingua araba. Io aggiungerei anche il suo contributo per il Martirio di Areta e il volume miscellaneo, che è un contributo anche alla letteratura cristiana di grosso significato, cui ha partecipato anche Alessandro Bausi. Allora, Alessandro Gori parlerà appunto del suo tema preferito, lingua e letteratura dei musulmani nel Corno d'Africa. Grazie.
Grazie e ringrazio l'Accademia Ambrosiana, ringrazio i colleghi, gli amici che mi hanno dato questa opportunità di essere presente qui tra voi stamani. È un grande piacere, un grande onore avere la possibilità di parlare in questa prestigiosissima sede. As an Italian who works abroad, unfortunately, I tend to use English in academic occasions, so I hope my fellow countrymen will not be offended if I did my presentation in English. So, and I also hope that the native speakers in the hall will not be offended by my English. Okay. Yes, first of all, I would like to say that some of the data that I will be presenting today were collected in the framework of a research project, whose framework is shown in the slide. So I have to thank the people of the staff cooperating with me in this project, and of course the European Research Council, who has generously supported the research I'm doing on the Islamic literatures in the Horn of Africa. And basically one of the main concerns of this research project is to make up for the delay that the research in this specific field has so far, as the field of the Islamic literary traditions in the Horn of Africa has been quite neglected by the scholars for several different reasons. Maybe Arabists didn't consider this area to be sufficiently Arab, and Africanists considered this area to be not sufficiently African. So it remained a little bit neglected by both sides. And so one of the main concerns of the project I am managing is to make up for the delay that we have. So I hope we will manage. We have 4 more years, almost 4 more years to go, and so I'm quite confident that we will be able to shed some fresh light on this neglected field. So there is speaking about languages and literatures of this very specific area of the Islamic world. Of course, there is a very broad theoretical framework which is very well known to Islamicists and experts in the literatures of the Islamic world. There are some dichotomies, opposition between classical Arabic and local language, both spoken and written, the birth of written traditions in local languages as opposed to the classical Arabic tradition, a possible opposition between a higher culture and lower culture, learned and popular culture. You know, this is a very broad scheme, and there is a very interesting Dachbegriff, so a kind of roof concept which encompasses all these problems, which is the so-called Islamic language or languages of Islam. By the way, this is not typical of only of the Islamic civilization. You would find more or less the same kind of opposition, for example, in the Jewish tradition, where you have, from the one side, tradition of writing in Hebrew and Aramaic, but you have then Yiddish, Judeo-Arabic, Ladino, and so on. And in that case, of course, the Dach-begriff would be Jewish language, Jewish languages. Speaking in Italy, of course, we have in the Italian Islamological tradition a very important starting point to discuss these issues, which is the work by Alessandro Bausani, who in several different contributions of his put the basis of the discussion of the Islamic languages. I have here in this slide some very basic bibliographical references. Of course, Alessandro Bausani was working and was elaborating these concepts, basically focusing on the eastern part of the Islamic world, Persian, Turkish, Urdu, Indonesian, which were the areas in which Bausani focused his attention. And the main basic references, the basic fundamentals of this concept of Islamic languages, according to Bausani, are the following one. There are in the Islamic world written languages strongly influenced by Arabic, or to some extent by Persian, Ottoman, Turkish models. It's a kind of bookish superstratum on written tradition in different local languages, and in all these oral literature, folklore is apparently less influenced by this learned superstratum. In Italy, starting from this basic reference, we have also some pioneering work on these problematics on Islamic languages in Africa. So, trying to, reducing the wide scope of the indications given by Bausani, we have some studies focusing, for example, on the Nigerian area. Yesterday we were talking about Sokoto. So there are some studies, for example, just selected some basic references by Brenner and Last about the role of local languages, Fulfulde and Hausa, as learned dialects for the religious explanation in northern Nigeria. Texts have a basic oral diffusion but are under a strong Arabic learned influence. This brought to the birth in the Fulfulde tradition of a corpus of texts which are orally transmitted but also written down in Fulfulde, the so-called Kabbe, which is based on Arabic models, especially where there is a basic reference, is the Aqidah al-Sughra li Sanusi, which is a basic catechism for Islam. And another Italian, Francesco Zappa, working in France, tried to apply this concept on the Bambara Islam, so Mali region. And he detected a strong influence of classical Arabic on local languages and a creation of what he terms an oral learned literature in the area, with a possible transition from the oral tradition to the written form, but with a very limited manuscript tradition. For the areas closer to the field where I do research, we have some references in the work of Rex Shon Ofahi and Alamin Mazrui, who tried to sort out the history of the birth of the Swahili language, especially, and they focused on, especially Ofahi, on the underlined the complementarity between a scribal fluency, as Ofahi terms it, in classical Arabic, so people who are able to write fluently in classical Arabic, and they tend to write anything which is important for them in classical Arabic, but connected with orality in the local language. So they would instruct, for example, in a Quranic school, let's say, they would instruct people in the local language, but if they had to write something, they would do it in Arabic. As for Swahili, Mazrui underlined the direct impact of Islam on the very birth of Kiswahili literature, but then he underlined also the intervention of missionaries and colonial administrators like Ludwig Krapf or Karl Meinhof, who pushed Swahili towards a less Islamized characterization. And this was, to a certain extent, evident in the passage from the traditional Kiswahili written in Arabic script to the contemporary Kiswahili written in Latin script. Other theoretical references for the area where I do research are in the works by Andrzejewski and Dreves, of course, who try to analyze the general presence of Arabic literary production in Somalia, and Dreves focused on the Harari and Amharic tradition, Islamic tradition in Ethiopia, and proposed an explanation of the presence of these two languages among the Muslims of the area as, to a certain extent, opposed to the view of Charles Ferguson, who detected the role of Arabic as lingua franca among Ethiopian Muslims, which is also a position to a certain extent supported by Lanfranco Ricci in his review article of the translation of the Amharic translation of the Quran, published in Ethiopia during the Haile Selassie regime, as opposed to the position of Dreves, who underlined the important role played by the local languages among Muslims of the Horn of Africa. Now, some general references to the linguistic situation in this area. Modern Standard Arabic is present in the whole area. For example, is one of the two official languages of Eritrea, and it was the official language also of Somalia until 1972. So there is a quite wide contemporary production of Arabic literature, and Arabic is present in the classical form, so as a written and sporadic oral usages, for example, in religious sermons and exhortations in the mosque. And there is also a kind of, there is a presence of some kinds of spoken Arabic. Classical Arabic is widely used in the Horn for teaching and learning. Manuscripts are attested in the area since the end of the 17th century, so they are quite recent if we compare it to what we know of course, the big Arabic manuscript tradition. These are relatively recent manuscripts. Okay, the oldest so far found dated Islamic manuscript in Ethiopia is the one that I show here in the slide. It is dated to the end of 1581. It is kept in the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, but it is of Egyptian origin. This is something that we can easily surmise because there is the name of the copyist, which is characterized by an Egyptian nisba, and the copyist is also attested as copyist of another manuscript which is now kept in the Ma'had al-Makhtutat al-Arabiya in Cairo. So it seems quite sure that it was copied in Egypt and then arrived in Ethiopia and was acquired by the Emir of Harar, Ahmad bin Muhammad bin Yusuf, in 1797-98. There is a seal. There is the seal of the Emir, so we are sure that it was bought by him and possessed by him. There are also printed books since 1920, great expansion of printed production in this area after the fall of the Derg regime in 1991. Muslims had the liberty to publish and to print in Ethiopia, so there will a very wide printed production, which is now available side by side with the manuscript tradition. Generally speaking, Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Somali Muslim elite did and do write extensively in classical Arabic. So we have locally produced works in classical Arabic. Main genres of this production are historiography, hagiography, Arabic grammar, tafsir, so a commentary of the Quran, aqidah, catechism, law, fiqh, and pietistic literature. There is one special case, in my opinion, that is the town of Harar, the walled town of Harar, which was the siege of an independent emirate between 1647 and 1885, and then once again for a very short period after the Egyptian occupation of the city for almost 10 years, between 85 and 87, when it was included in the Menelik's Ethiopia. Here we find quite a wide production of manuscripts in Arabic and Harari, copied and produced in town. So in the local Harari language, Semitic language is spoken and used only in this area of the city and the surroundings, and in Arabic, classical Arabic. So we have a huge Arabic manuscript tradition in Harar, the first dated Arabic manuscript from Harar containing a some works of a local learned man is dated to 1765, and it is now kept in the Vatican Library. It was acquired by Enrico Cerulli. And then we have a tradition in the local language called Old Harari, to distinguish it from the contemporary spoken language of the city, which is quite different from this written language. And we have a manuscript tradition there starting since the 18th century. One of the main characteristics of these local Harari, Old Harari manuscript tradition is the fact that it's clearly detected a tendency to orthographic standardization. This was studied by Professor Giorgio Banti. And this, I think, is one of the main hints to the birth and the development of a consistently used and living manuscript tradition. Once you have a tendency toward the standardization of the writing system. Otherwise, I think that it is more difficult to speak about a structured manuscript tradition. Main themes of the Harari literary tradition are pietistic literature, basic instruction in text in theology and law, for example, the very famous Kitab al-Fara'id. One thing that must be stressed is that this literature is now almost incomprehensible for the contemporary people living in Harar. You find very few learned men who are able to read and understand these texts. So this is a hint to the fact that the tradition is fading out and dying out. And if we try to apply the concept elaborated by Zappa for Bambara, or about the existence of a oral learned literature in Harari, I would say that in this case we could not detect that so far, because the Harari language is basically the language only of the Harari people. It's not understood outside the city, so it cannot be used by others, differently from Bambara, which is acquired a status of wide usage outside the specific Bambara people, and so it's practically unknown by other Ethiopian Muslims. So Harari could not play the role of a kind of learned communication, oral communication language among Muslims of the Horn. A few things about other local written tradition of the Muslims of the Horn of Africa. We have a limited written tradition in Ajami. When I say Ajami, I refer to the Nigerian Ajami tradition, so the local written tradition in Arabic script, but in Hausa or Fulfulde, which is called Ajami, and we apply normally this as a technical term also for other regions of the Islamic world. We have some very recent manuscripts since the 19th century are attested. Most of them are written down in the 20th century, so they are very, very recent. We have more or less always the same kind of genres, literary genres for this literary production, pietistic literature, instruction basics. All of these texts have also an oral circulation, so they are learned by heart and they are recited. So it could be surmised that actually these very recent manuscripts are nothing more than an aide de memoire for recitation. So they are not really meant to be circulating as written text, but as a support for learning how to recite the text. This is my impression. And this is also testified that you don't have in this Oromo and Amharic text a standardized orthography so far. So every scribe or every copyist uses his own orthography to write Amharic and Oromo in Arabic script. So it seems that the circulation is very, of the written item is very limited and conceived as a kind of a by-side support to the oral and recited circulation of the text. And these texts are, from a broader perspective, are those who are used to, as a kind of, to indigenize, I don't know if in English it is used this word, I mean to make Islam and Islamic tenets closer to the local people, so, and closer to the average believer. So the texts are normally full of learned references to the history and principles of Islam, but they are meant to transmit these basic tenets to the average believer. And they are mostly very simple description of the tenets of the religion, which the simple believer is supposed to learn by heart while reciting and hearing and reciting the texts. We have another phenomenon, which is the Islamization of these languages, thanks to, this is a very recent phenomenon, thanks to the printed Islamic literature, Infidel. And so we have the expansion of Amharic and Oromo as Islamic language used by Muslims in their communication, daily communication and instruction. And the same thing would apply to Somali. More or less what I have said for Oromo and Amharic could be applied also to Somali. We don't have a full-fledged manuscript tradition in Somali. We have scattered examples of written text in different dialects of the Somali language. We have, for example, a very specific case of Kimbalazi in Brawa, which is a Bantu language spoken in the city of Brawa in Somalia, which has, we found some manuscripts, few manuscripts written in this language of the kind I mentioned before for Oromo and Amharic, so pietistic literature, poems to be recited to make people understand the basic tenets of Islam. And it seems to me that we cannot speak of a full-fledged manuscript tradition, but just of some texts which were written down at a certain point to help people memorize these texts. So the Sheikh was using the written version to keep, to a certain extent, fix the text, but people who are not able to read, nor Arabic, nor the local language in Arabic script, people learned the text by heart, just because they hear it recited. And some tentative conclusions. These are very, very tentative conclusions because, as I was telling at the very beginning of the presentation, it's what I am presenting are some data that I'm collecting while doing research. So the local Islamic literary traditions in the Horn, in Amharic, Oromo, Somali, I didn't mention, but you could find also Tigrinya text written in Arabic script. You could find Afar text written in Arabic script. Seems to me to be only complementary to Arabic in content, strongly influenced by Arabic language and sources. All these Ajami, so local languages written in Arabic script, are only rarely read nowadays. And the way to transfer the basic religious instruction contained in this text to the average believers remains basically the recitation and the learning by heart. But I don't have the impression that the written texts were really used to teach and to make people learn. There is one partial exception in all this, which is Harar. Harar is an exception because, as we said, we can detect the birth of a structured manuscript tradition in the local language, and so we can imagine, we have the impression that also the manuscripts and the written tradition was the tool to spread the knowledge. And as a contemporary phenomenon, we have to notice the formation of Islamic communication languages. We don't want to call them Islamic languages in the way Bauzani was thinking this point. Is a contemporary phenomenon, and it's linked to the spread of the Islamic printing press in the area, and the production of booklets for the believers in the local languages. Most of these booklets are translations from Arabic, and I think that in the long run this will produce a kind of variant of the common language, which will become more and more specific to the Islamic community. And I would foresee that, for example, the usage of many loanwords from Arabic or of new creation from Arabic lexical basis will be one of the main characteristics of this Islamized variant of Amharic, for example. We have some hints to that, the use, for example, of the verb خلق instead of فطر, the use of the loan word iman instead of haymanot. And of course there is an ideological also feeling behind that. The idea that iman of the Muslims is not the haymanot of the whole group, and that God, which is called normally Allah and not Exyabeher, khalaqa, so created instead of fattara. Okay. So these are a few observations that I wanted to show to you, and I hope you were interested by them. Thank you for your attention.
Grazie per questa esposizione e anche per tutti gli accenni alle ricerche in corso e possibili anche in futuro in questo campo che sembra di un interesse enorme. Noi abbiamo qualche minuto per la discussione, penso che le due relazioni di stamattina aprono una serie di problemi di carattere sia filologico sia storico e quindi darei la parola al pubblico riservandomi anch'io poi la possibilità di fare qualche domanda. Please. Professor. Yeah, yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
The hall is
a very interesting presentation, I must say. I wonder, there is a kind of practical problem in your project. Manuscripts can be catalogued, manuscripts can be found, can be photographed. But I think the real problem is the oral tradition that goes beyond, let's say, writing. And the oral tradition in East Africa is, as you know, very strong and is developing. When you take, for example, the great saint Sinur Hossein Bani, who is a central, key figure in the Islam of the Horn of Africa, people from Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, of various linguistic origins, take a pilgrimage to Bale, where his sanctuary is, and while doing so, they create new songs about Nur Hussein of Bale. How do you deal with that, let's say, in terms of your are you looking for only the ones, the oral literatures that have been written down, like you did, like Andrzejewski and like Dreves, and I should add, if I were you, I should also add Didier Morin, who did very nice work on Afar, on Oromo and Somali recently, very recent work. So do you include only the ones that are written, which is by itself a contradiction, of course? Or do you try to include samples of oral tradition, which I would highly appreciate myself, but I'm not the one who directs this project?
No, well, the project is basically focused on the written tradition, but as I was mentioning, we can easily detect the fact that some texts which we found written down are actually the direct writing down of something which was transmitted orally, and we can find that, for example, in the fact that they are still used in recitation. So you have the written version from the one side with a manuscript tradition, which sometimes is very well established. I can quote one example which is, I would say, kind of master example. You have in Harar, you have a collection of texts which is used for Maulid, and so it is clearly detectable that this collection of text has its own manuscript tradition. So we have several codices of this collection, so you can study to a certain extent, the history of the transmission of the text, how the collection was put together in the written form, how it was copied and transmitted and handled and handed over in the written form. At the same time, you have the performance. So you have people gathering on Maulid, but not only on Maulid, on several different occasions, both private and public occasions, who sing or recite or use this collection while performing it orally. So what I would like, I started studying actually, already started studying that, is the interaction between the oral usage of the text and the written tradition. In this case, it is possible. In other case, I'm afraid that once the oral tradition didn't came to a written form whatsoever, just as I was mentioning, as a memento for the reciters or for the sheikh who composed the poems in honor of Sheikh Hussein, I don't know, or whatever other, whoever other wali in the area. It will not be part of my project, which is basically focused on the written sources. So oral tradition for my project will be questioned only when a direct link will be detected between something which I have in manuscripts and something which I know it is the direct corresponding performance of that written text.
Do I understand correctly that you found Brahmese manuscripts
Yes.
in the language of Brahma?
In the language of Brahma, yes. Yes.
Okay, that's very interesting. I think it will be one of the first few things that you can.
Very few things. There is an expert who's called Mechal Mumin in Köln, who is dealing with that. And it's one of these traditions which I tend to consider not really fully developed. There are just few texts, few manuscripts, all recent, which are not create. They didn't manage to create a full-fledged tradition of written text. Just
Also there you find a tradition that's kind of being born.
Yeah.
I remember that I met someone which in 1983 who was deeply involved in this language. He was a speaker of Brahmins, and I think he was even a teacher of Italian at the University of Italy. And he said that also we could say Islamic songs were created in Brahmin. Quite interesting. Go on. Good luck.
thank you.
Ci sono questioni sempre sulla...
Question about the manuscript from Brahma.
Oh,
related
In Brava you have a very beautiful publication of two volumes about the registers of the Qadi court, so text, legal text, but they are all in Arabic. They are all in Arabic. Two big volumes by Vianello and Mukhtar, and they had access to the so let's say to the Qadi, so the judge, Islamic judge court, to the register of the Islamic court in Brava in the 19th century, and they published the whole set of registers, but they are all in Arabic, classical Arabic, as it should be for a Qadi, a judge. And you, of course, you could always have, as I was saying, I don't have the impression that any of these very local written traditions had the chance to become a very structured or full-fledged manuscript tradition, as we know from other cultural environments of the area, Christian Ethiopian, for example. So you would always be able to find short texts written in any of these languages about anything, just because the use of the language, of the written language, of these local languages in the written form is to a certain extent extemporaneous. And this comes to what I said, that so far we were not able to find a structured manuscript tradition. I don't know if I expressed myself sufficiently clearly, but the usage of the written form for these languages, local languages, is so devoid of any structured tradition behind, that you would be able to find any kind of text on any topic, just because the usage of the written form for these languages is not submitted to any constraint from a tradition. So yes.